Welcome everybody to God and Deer. How's the sound at the back? Can you hear me okay back there? Fantastic. I might even try it without the microphone. How's the... we definitely need to use the mic. So let's begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us as we forgive those who trespass against us. Saint Joseph, pray for us. The Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost. Okay, once again, welcome. My name's John Smythe. And thank you all for coming tonight. As you can see, we've got the great man next to me here, Professor Dr Bhattacharya from Stanford University. The topic for tonight is a Christian response to the pandemic. And when I thought about what Christians would do in a pandemic, when there's a plague around, something like that, my mind went back to stories I'd read about the early church in the Roman Empire when there were plagues around, and the Christians at that time drew a lot of attention and surprised a lot of people by caring for the sick at the risk of their own lives, at the risk of their own health during that time in the early church. And it surprised people so much that they went, "Wow, these Christians they're crazy. There's something different about them. They have this love for each other, for other people that we haven't seen before. This is something new." And it played a big role, as I understand it, in the conversion of the first people who became Christians in Europe. So anyway, that's what I thought of when I thought of Christians in a pandemic. But over the last couple of years, we've seen something different, obviously. Anyway, a couple of months ago, I felt a really strong desire to try and bring someone to Australia who would make an impact on our public health debate. Someone who would maybe bring a different perspective than what's been dominating in Australia over the last couple of years. I looked for someone who was courageous and articulate and very accomplished. And the number one person on my list was the man standing over here, Professor Dr Bhattacharya. And I think we've got all of those things in him. We've got a courageous and accomplished and very articulate spokesperson for the people who feel like maybe we haven't handled things the best over the last couple of years. We've got all that from him. But what I didn't know that I was getting when I invited him over was I didn't know that Jay was a Christian. And it became apparent during our discussions that he was a Christian, and I was very excited to hear that. I said, "Yeah, Jay, I'm a Christian too, and I'm a Catholic, and I organise this event once a month called God and Beer, where we have a talk about faith and culture and how it relates to our lives, and would you be willing to give a talk to that crowd?" And Jay said he'd love to. He actually gave a talk at the Vatican not that long ago to a group of people, which was similar to the talk we'll be hearing tonight. As I've gotten to know Jay a little bit over the last couple of days, I found out we have a shared love of some great Catholic and Christian authors like C.S. Lewis and G.K. Chesterton, Peter Kraft, Tim Keller, and J.R.R. Tolkien. It's been really beautiful to find that we have so much in common like that. I could try and list Jay's qualifications for you. I tried to write them down, but trust me, it's just not possible. There's too many. There were PhDs, and he's a medical doctor, and he's about 20 other things. It's just too hard. I'm sorry. I gave up in despair. He's a very accomplished man, professor at Stanford University, and I think I've said enough. Here's Professor Dr Bhattacharya.
It's a great honor to be here. I just wanted to finish that thought about Christians and our response to disease. And our example is Christ, because when I went to medical school, I had this thought in my head, and it still rings with me today. What did Christ do when he met the leper? physically touch them.
Yeah.
They were unclean, and the act of physically touching them, of course, he healed them, but was a social revolution, because that means that we have to physically touch others who may be unclean. That's the example, I think. For Christians, I think the teaching is really clear. And I think what's happened during the pandemic that's absolutely shocked me is that many churches made the act of treating others as a biohazard as an act of love. And I think I think this is something that churches we're going to have to deal with. I'm going to talk mostly about some of the policy responses. I'm going to give you a little bit of the science, but I wanted to start with that as a background. I'll end with how I think churches have done. Actually, there's some churches that have done quite well, but also like I think many churches have, I think broadly have failed. And I think as a Christian, it's been quite disappointing to me, but it's also an opportunity. And hopefully we can bring some of that out. Okay, so first let me start with how deadly is COVID. Is it the plague? Are you going to die if you come in contact with somebody who has had COVID? Now, we've now been through 2.5 years. We all know the answer to that question is no. But think back to March of 2020. We didn't really know, right? I remember the World Health Organization, if you can't see this, don't worry, I'm going to tell you what it says. The World Health Organization said that there was a 3.4% mortality risk from dying if you get COVID. They announced that in February 2020. And I remember looking at that and saying, okay, that number is so high that it's going to cause tremendous panic. The second thought I had was, this number can't be this high. It has to be mistaken, because you have a highly infectious respiratory virus pandemic happening in China, in Italy. It's spreading very rapidly. The people that they're seeing, that they're coming in the denominator of this 3.4%, must be a select sample. The people sick enough to show up at the hospital. 3.4% of those people are dying. But what about all the people that got infected, never really got that sick, didn't go to the hospital, and didn't die, and then didn't get counted? The death rate has to be lower than that. So I wrote an op-ed that changed my life. I wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal. It was the first time in my life I'd ever written an op-ed. All of my other publications in my history has been boring scientific publications. You go look them up. You'll be the 8th person that read each of them. I wrote an op-ed saying, well, what if there's all these other people that have had the infection? We need to find that out. If that's true, then we're not dealing with the pandemic we think we're dealing with. Here, they were arguing that this is a relatively few people had gotten infected, and they were really, really sick from it. And the thought I had was, based on decades of work in infectious disease epidemiology, we don't know that to be a fact. What if many, many people have been infected, and in fact the disease is much less deadly than this? Which I wrote in the op-ed. This op-ed changed my life. It led to a man in Major League Baseball in the United States. He had ordered a whole bunch of antibody test kits, antibodies to check for antibodies for COVID, to use in Major League Baseball players. And he called me up, said, I didn't know who he was, never met him before. He just read the op-ed. I never imagine this would happen, but he offered me the test kit, said, I don't want to use them for baseball. I want to use them for good. And so I organized 2 major studies to look to see in Santa Clara County, California, where I live, and in Los Angeles County, how many people had been infected with COVID but never showed up at the doctor. So here are the 2 studies. One we published when was this published? This was May 2020, and the other one, it took forever to publish. We published in February 2021, but they were both conducted in April of 2020. Both of them conducted in April of 2020. What we found was that there was, okay, you're not going to be impressed by this, but there were 3% of Santa Clara County residents and 4% of LA County residents had already been infected in April of 2020. 4%, right? That doesn't sound like a big number, but it's a huge number. because that meant that for every person that had been identified as having had COVID, there were 50 people wandering around that had had COVID and recovered that nobody knew about. And that meant the death rate was 0.2%, 99.8% survival. I mean, 0.2%. 100 other studies just like this were done after this around the world. And they found that the death rate from the virus is about 0.27%. So what's that? That's 99.73% survival. How are you willing to risk dying at 0.27%? I mean, it's actually weirdly, it's not obvious. Some people looked at that number and still thought it was quite high. The key thing, though, is not that number. The key thing is the age gradient. Young people, children especially, thank God, are relatively immune to dying if they're infected. When I saw that number, when I saw the survival rate, let me show you the survival rate numbers by age. Look on the left over here. So if you are 0 to 19 years old, the survival rate is 99.997. If you're 5 years old, it's 99.9999. I'm going to run on nines soon enough. It's really, really low, and I thanked God because that meant my children were not at risk. Now, if you're in your 50s, it's a 0.3% death rate. 0.3%, 99.7% survival. Every 7 years of age, it doubles. Now, this is during the original wave. Omicron is less deadly than that, more survival than that. Okay, and if you plot countries, their survival here on this axis, or the survival rate on this axis, and the proportion that are over 85, the countries that are the oldest, Italy, Spain, they all have like really high death rates. And countries that are younger, India, have low death rates. There's a reason why Africa has had so little death from COVID. It's because 3% of the population is over 65, 3%. Okay, so that's fact number one. There's this steep age gradient in mortality. Did you ever see this ad? I was absolutely shocked when I saw this ad. This is propaganda.
Yes.
Right, this is a young woman who's, let's look at, what is she, could be 20s? She's 20s, let's say 20s. The survival rate for 20s is 99.986%. Very, very few young women end up like this. And yet, this is what you saw in Australia. This is an Australian ad. Why did they put this ad? Yes. They were creating fear. Right? They wanted to cause young people to think that this was a very deadly disease for them, so that they would agree to the restrictions in their lives that were imposed by the government with these lockdowns. The lockdowns were incredibly damaging. I'm going to show you, and your mind is going to go numb in a few minutes because it's just too hard to take. I'm going to show you some of the damage done by the lockdowns. The point of this is that the lockdowns are uniformly harmful, but the disease itself is mainly harmful to older people. All right, let's start. I gave this talk at the Vatican, and I decided I was going to put a few reminders of what we as Christians have committed ourselves to when we accepted Christ. So, Luke 4:18, the Spirit of the Lord is on me because He has anointed me to proclaim the good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, recovery sight for the blind, set the oppressed free. We live in an upside-down world. The poor, the meek, are the ones that are exalted in our kingdom. We are to live our lives for the poor. Right? That's what we're called to do. How well did we do with the lockdowns? So let me talk about poverty. Over the last 40 years, what's happened is an absolutely extraordinary thing. 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty. 1 billion people have lifted out of poverty around the world. The globalization of the economy, it has had many faults and many problems. But the one good thing that it is certainly done is it has reduced the number of poor people from nearly 2 billion in 1991 to about 659 million on the eve of the lockdowns. The lockdowns, based on some estimates from the World from the World Bank, increased the number of people living in dire poverty by about 100 million. It created 100 million people living at $2 a day of income or less. What are the consequences of that? So we now have more poor to care for, I guess. So what are the consequences of that? The consequences of that are, if you live on $2 a day of income or less, even the smallest shock will put you into starvation. And that's what's happening. Let me tell a little bit of a story of this Indian lockdown. The Indian lockdown was absolutely draconian. There are about 500 million people in India living as migrant workers in some of the big cities. Migrant workers, they live in the big cities, but their home may be 10, 20, 40, 100 miles away, sometimes even 1,000 miles away. Many of them work hand to mouth, which means that they buy some coconuts, they sell the coconuts to rich Mumbai IT workers on the street. With the money they get, they buy coconuts for the next day, and then they buy food for their family. When the lockdowns hit, those workers living hand to mouth lost their entire life savings overnight. When they were ordered to go back to their home cities, sometimes, again, 1,000 miles away, and they walked, some of them walked, many of them, they were these crowded trains, some of them biked. 1,000, there's 500 million of them, 1,000 died that day. And some academics labeled this new trail of tears. That's the reality of what the lockdown was in poor countries. And that was just the beginning of the cruelty of it. The hunger followed. So in April of 2020, the UN World Food Program estimated that they said COVID-19 will double the number of people facing food crises. Does COVID-19 make you starve? No. What makes you starve? What makes you starve is poverty and deprivation. The economic dislocation caused by the lockdowns essentially harmed every single poor person on the face of the earth. Every single one of them. And for people living at $2 a day of income or less, it meant starvation. It meant they couldn't feed their kids. And the estimate was that there would be 130 million additional people starving as a consequence of the economic impact of COVID-19. When we globalized our economies, the poor countries of the world reorganized their economies so that they would fit in with the rich countries. And the lockdowns broke that promise overnight. That's what caused this increase in this food crisis. It didn't actually turn out to be 130 million. The estimates later turned out to be something on the order of 70, 80 million people. Only 70 or 80 million people starving. This was a report from March 17, 2021 in the BBC, based on a UN estimate, that 228,000 children had died in South Asia alone because of the economic dislocation caused by COVID-19 lockdowns. It's not just that India had a lockdown. It's that the rich countries, the United States, when the United States has an economic downturn, it impacts poor countries everywhere. When Australia has an economic downturn, you're deeply connected to the rest of the world. Okay, on fear. Fear not, I'm with you. Be not dismayed. I'm your God. I will strengthen you. Yes, I'll help you. I'll uphold you with my righteous right hand. Actually, I was going to put this earlier after the 0.2 death rate, just to make some sense of the 0.2. We're not supposed to be scared of this. I mean, COVID is a scary disease. I mean, make no question, especially if you're older. But we have more than this life to look forward to. Okay. Let me talk about schooling and kids, because I think it's kids that have been harmed the most by these lockdowns. In Northern California, where I live, my kids were out of school, public school, for nearly a year and a half. When they finally did get to go see in person, some of the teachers were sitting about 12 feet from them, talking into their computer, while my kids were sitting on their computer 12 feet from them in the same room. That was in-person schooling at the end of, for like 5 days at the end of a year and a half of not being in person. I know for a fact in Melbourne also, kids had tremendously disrupted schooling. But it's worse in poor countries. So this story is from Uganda. You can't read it about, so I'll just tell you what happened in Uganda. There's about 15 million children in Uganda that would go to the public schools. Estimated that all of them, all those 15 million, did not see the inside of a schoolhouse for 2 straight years. 4.5 million of them didn't show up for Zoom school because they didn't have Zoom, and never came back to school when the school opened again. Those 4.5 million kids will spend the rest of their lives and die of poverty. Schooling is the single biggest investment, probably the highest return investment we make as a society. And we decided that those kids weren't worth it for 2 years because we were scared of COVID. Okay, I told you this is going to be depressing. I can't help it. I think these are the kinds of things we have to look at squarely in the eye if we're gonna decide we're never going to do this again. What are the consequences of that? In November of 2020, a friend of mine, who's the editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association Pediatrics, did a study where he projected out what are the consequences of missing school. Now there's a large social science literature that preceded the epidemic. And what it says is that if you miss school for even a short period of time, it has long-term consequences on your economic well-being, yes, because you're just not as well educated, but also on your health and longevity. So these studies they're very clever studies. They look at school districts where you're mandated to be in school till age 16. Next door, there's a school district where you're mandated to be in school till age 17. They change from 16 to 17. And the kids that grew up in the mandated schools until age 17, they lead longer lives, healthier lives than the kids that were 16, tracked over decades. So we knew when we closed schools, we were consigning our children to shorter, less healthy lives, poorer lives. And the estimate my friend came up with is that missed instruction during 2020, that's spring of 2020, so 3 short months, could be associated with an estimated 13.8 million years of life lost based on data on US studies. We robbed our children in the United States, just from that spring lockdown, of 13.8 million life years because adults were afraid. $17 trillion in lifetime learnings from those lockdowns in the United States. We robbed from our kids. This is generational theft. This is what Mark 10, 13, 14, on the treatment of children. People were bringing little children to Jesus for him to place his hands on them, but the disciples rebuked them. When Jesus saw this, he was indignant. He said to them, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these." Mental and physical health. You all lived through the longest lockdown in the world. I don't need to tell you about the mental health consequences that you've lived it. But they really, truly are dire. I'll just tell you a little bit about the physical consequences first. Just from the first lockdown, you can't read this. Don't squint. Just look at me while I tell you about this. During the first lockdown in the United States, people with heart attacks were so afraid to go to the hospital that they died at home from a heart attack because they were scared of COVID, and because public health told them to be scared of COVID and that they should not go to the hospital because they didn't want hospital systems overwhelmed. The number of people that this is up here is how many people normally get breast cancer screening. And this is the number of people that actually got breast cancer screening in early 2020. What is the consequence of breast cancer screening dropping in half? That means that women are going to show up with late-stage breast cancer today and die from it that should have survived it if they'd just been picked up earlier. Colorectal cancer screening, no one wants to get a colonoscopy, that's no fun, but I've had one, I can tell you it's no fun. But it reduces the rate of which people die of colon cancer. So men and women are going to die of colon cancer because there was the rate of colon cancer screening cut in half in 2020. If you're a diabetic, it's very, very important that you control your blood sugar. And usually that means regular visits with your doctor. Those were ended in the United States for a while in 2020. It took a long time for it to return. In Melbourne, this is even worse. In Australia, because now what you have is an incredible backlog of patients that have waiting to see the doctors for not just routine care, but often for vital care. And it's caused by these lockdowns. The consequences of the lockdowns on physical health are going to be paid for by adults for a very long time, adults and children for a very long time. All right, hold on, mental health. You can't see this, but this is probably one of the most dramatic studies I read during the entire pandemic, and let me tell you what it says. This was a study done by the United States Centers for Disease Control. Every year what they do is they go out and they ask a random sample of people around the United States, did you consider suicide last month? Did you seriously consider suicide last month? Normally for young adults, it's on the order of 3 or 4%. It's hopeless. The numbers are there just so you can look at me instead of that. It's 3 or 4%. In June of 2020, 1 in 4 young adults seriously considered suicide. 1 in 4 young adults seriously considered suicide, and that was after the spring lockdown of essentially 6, 7, 8 weeks. You all were in lockdown for 270 weeks. I can't begin to imagine the consequence that had on the mental health of young people and older people alike. And it's not people are not resilient to that. We're made for connection. We're made for community. We're created with that purpose. It's not good for Adam to be alone. That means it's not good for us to be alone. But somehow that was what health was, right? Keeping apart from each other. All right. Deep breath, you guys. We're done with the lockdown arms. Everyone, stretch your arms out. It's okay. Now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about, did it work? Was it worth it? Okay, so there's a literature on whether lockdowns worked in countries like the United States, where they very clearly didn't work. The disease spread very rapidly despite the lockdowns in the United States. The disease spread very rapidly in the Northern Hemisphere, even though there were all these countries that locked down one after the other. Now you can't tell just from that it didn't work. You need a control group. The control group is, in the United States, the control group is Florida. Florida was, the governor of Florida, okay, this is such a strange turn in my life, you have no idea. I never talked to a politician before this. The governor of Florida called me in September of 2020 on this cell phone. I don't know how he got my number. And we talked for 2 hours about COVID studies. About all the, in fact, you just heard the content of the conversation I was having with him just now. And he opened up Florida shortly after that.
Wow.
I mean, he was reading that. It wasn't just me. There were other folks he was talking with. Martin Kulldorff, some of the other names that you may have heard of. California, through the pandemic, has had almost exactly the same age-adjusted COVID mortality per capita as Florida.
Yeah.
But their schools were open, their business didn't shut down, their unemployment stayed at around 2% the entire pandemic. California, the businesses closed, the churches closed, the schools closed. There's another control group in Europe. Everyone heard of it? It's a little tiny country in the north, which has the most sane health policy on the face of the planet, Sweden. Their excess mortality through the pandemic is near zero. They didn't close elementary schools or primary schools the entire pandemic with no restrictions on kids' lives at all. What they did was they tried. In the early days, they actually did they actually did fail. They sent COVID-infected patients back to nursing homes in Stockholm, leading to a tremendous death in elderly people early in the pandemic. And that led to a whole suite of stories about how Sweden was a failed state. But they adjusted their policy, protected older people, didn't disrupt the lives of young people, still told people this is a dangerous disease, so we shouldn't have mass gatherings at the height of the pandemic, but they told people that. So it's not like they did nothing. But what they did is they trusted people to make good decisions. Said, here's who's at high risk. If you know an elderly neighbor, go deliver groceries to them. So they gave resources. They had sick leave for people who were sick, so that they didn't have to worry about feeding their family. Versus, in the United States, you got sick and you didn't have sick leave. That meant you had to make a decision: do I feed my family or do I go to work and spread the disease? So they had a lot of policies that actually worked to protect the population, and they had very good outcomes without any lockdowns. Why did I come to Melbourne? One of the reasons, I think God brought me here, but I tell you, one of the reasons I came is because Melbourne and Australia are the ground zero for lockdown success. Right? So whenever I give talks where people are debating with me, they'll say, well, look, Australia conquered the disease. I think if we win the argument here that the lockdowns were not worthwhile, we've won it the entire world round. You all are at ground zero for the lockdown argument. So did it work in Melbourne? Okay, so did it work in Australia? This is the number of cumulative confirmed cases of COVID-19, European Union, US, New Zealand, and Australia. This is March 2020, and this is roughly today. Through most of it, Australia is in light blue. And this is, every time I would do a debate about the lockdown's effectiveness, someone would point to this number and say, look, Australia has had no cases. And the United States has had, this is what I read, has had a lot of cases. My God, you're crazy, the lockdowns are the only way to stop the disease. What happened was that Australia and New Zealand had the great cleverness to be located in the southern hemisphere in March 2020. This was your summer, right? If I get it right? This is our winter. And this disease, when it seeds, it still spreads, but it spreads much more efficiently in winter months than it does in summer months. And so when you had the original border closures, that actually did get your cases down to zero. You actually did succeed by the business, not so much the lockdowns, but by the closure of your borders, preventing expats from coming home and burying their fathers or mothers. That was a small cost to pay to get to zero. And what that meant is that success, that early success, led you down a path where you were trapped in that success. Every time there was a few cases, what would happen is your government would say, we have to lock down, we have to get to zero again. Their entire success, their entire sort of story about the policy was hinged on keeping COVID out. The entire focus of Australian policy for two years was to keep COVID out. And it succeeded. Honestly, it succeeded. Through September of 2020, January 2022, almost no COVID. Whereas Europe and the United States both suffered severely from COVID. Same thing in New Zealand. They kept it out. They kept it out longer than you guys. Were they bragging in February and March? Okay, that's the number of cases. It obviously ultimately failed, right? You have suffered through 8 months of COVID, and finally the cases have come down. The end point of this pandemic is nearly everybody gets COVID. You can protect yourself, but essentially that means you have to isolate it. Only actually a relatively small fraction of the population can afford to do that. Okay, what happened is the vaccines were developed and disseminated in December of 2020. The vaccination program I know there's a lot of people skeptical about vaccines, but I have to say that if not for the vaccines, you probably would still be in lockdown. The vaccines freed you from lockdown because what it did is it gave people a reason to think that you didn't need the lockdowns to keep people safe. And in fact, the vaccines actually do reduce the death rate from COVID for older people mainly. Let me show you what happened with the vaccination campaign. This was in February 2021. 14% of the UK had been vaccinated. About 1% had been fully vaccinated. In the US, 2.4% had been vaccinated fully, and then 9.1% had received the first dose. In February 2021, basically nobody had been vaccinated in Australia. Why is that? This is because of the lockdown. Australia didn't think it needed to be vaccinated very quickly. What could have happened is you could have vaccinated January, March 2021, your older population, protected them from COVID, and then opened up. Instead of waiting a full extra year before opening up. Because of the early success with the lockdowns, it led to complacency in the vaccination campaign. And so this is February 2021, April 2021, Australia, 2.9%. UK vaccinated 47% of its population, America 34%. Nearly every elderly person had received a vaccine in both countries, or at least been offered one in both countries. My mom finally got vaccinated by this time. I was actually relieved. I was vaccinated late April 2021. 3 months later, I got COVID. Actually, how many people were vaccinated in the room and then got COVID? How many people were vaccinated and still never has had COVID? A few of you, it's about 50-50 in the room. I'm often in rooms I'll get everyone who's vaccinated has had COVID. It's very difficult to avoid it, and the vaccine doesn't protect you against getting COVID. What the vaccine does is it reduces the mortality risk if you get COVID, which is very important for older people, but much less important for young people because the mortality risk for COVID for young people is I'll show you, quite low. Okay, so this is April 2021. This is June. Australia, only 15% still vaccinated. New Zealand, 8.5%. 33% in August. And finally in October, the campaign to get vaccinated got going in earnest. Why was the vaccination campaign? Now, once you already vaccinated all your old by this point, all the elderly, at least that wanted it. Why was there such a push to vaccinate everybody, including young people? I get money. I'll tell you, okay. I'm not an economist. I'm not naive. I know money plays a big role. You need an intellectual reason too, in addition to the pecuniary one. The intellectual reason is a mistake. The idea that the vaccine stops disease transmission. The vaccine stops disease transmission. So if you vaccinate a sufficient number of people, then the disease will stop transmitting, and you can have zero COVID. The idea was that by vaccinating everyone, we could get rid of the disease. The problem is the vaccine doesn't stop transmission. You saw all the hands in the room that raised their hand that got the vaccine and also got sick, including me. That means that you can't use the vaccine to end the pandemic. You can use the vaccine to protect older people, but you can't use it to get to herd immunity. And the end point of this pandemic is herd immunity. This is December 2021. then February. Basically, Australia now is among the most vaccinated countries on Earth in February 2022, and yet you've had this tremendous bout of cases. The vaccine does not stop transmission. I'll show you what it does do. This is the death rate per capita. And that's the American death rate is up on top, then the European Union, and then down below is Australia and New Zealand. You had about 1/5 the deaths per capita from COVID than the United States and Australia, than the United States and European Union. And the reason is the vaccines.
What were the death rates for people? All those other reasons you spoke about, there are death rates for being locked down.
Absolutely. I'm not saying that this is not complete accounting. This is just COVID death rates. Let me show you the all-cause mortality rate to help answer that question. This is the all-cause mortality rate for Australia through the pandemic. Right. So in 2020, you had a negative 1.2% all-cause mortality. A huge cause for success. You kept COVID out. You actually reduced the mortality relative to the previous years by 1.2%. Lives saved by lockdowns, right? In 2021, all-cause mortality jumped to 3.5% above norms. Even though COVID was kept out, you had an additional 3.5% of people die at rates. Death rates were 3.5% higher than they should have been. What was that? That's lockdown deaths. And this year we're not done yet, but the all-cause, this is zero, this line is 0%. This is your all-cause death rates are 15, 16, 17. At some point it was almost 30% above norms. You had a tremendous level of death this past year in Australia. The vaccines protected against COVID, but it didn't protect against death. We don't have a technology to protect against death. And the lockdowns, maybe some vaccine harms, and COVID, all three contributed to the tremendous deaths that you've seen this year in Australia. I didn't plot, but I should have plotted Sweden. It's at zero. They had some level of high deaths in 2020, but in 2021 and 2022, it's negative.
Let me just ask, 2019, the year before the pandemic, we had quite a high deaths from flu. Would that have influenced?
Yeah, that definitely biases this. If you had high death rates before, that means the expected deaths are high.
Yeah.
And so if you smooth out, I'm taking the best case for this. If you go 2018 or before, you get higher death rate. You get your the all-cause excess deaths will be, the expected death rates are high, and you change this pretty substantially. But the norm is to go to 2015 to 2019, so, Okay, I love this, I don't love this fact, but I love this line. Lockdowns are a luxury of the laptop class. Lots of L's. Alliteration is a very powerful rhetorical tool, it turns out. But it's also true. About 20% of the American population have jobs that can be replaced by Zoom. Zoom is the reason we had the lockdowns. Zoom caused the lockdowns. The question is, why didn't we have a lockdown in 2009 during the swine flu epidemic? Because we didn't have Zoom. You didn't have 20% of the population able to replace their job and face almost no difficulty in terms of economic well-being while being locked down. You have people deliver your groceries to you. You could live, quite happily if you're a misanthrope without any problem with the lockdown if you could afford it. But if you weren't in that 20%, then you face severe difficulties. When you're a single mom with a 7-year-old kid that has to go to school on Zoom and you have to work, you're an essential worker. So you choose between watching over your kid's education, who's otherwise going to be playing Call of Duty all day, or going to work. It's very tough choices, right? Or worse, maybe you're a poor Ugandan parent and your kids don't have Zoom, and they're just missing school. You can't afford to feed your kids. Many of them actually, in poor countries, the rates of of little girls being sold into sexual slavery skyrocketed. Child abuse skyrocketed. But not for the laptop class. So this is from this data are from Toronto. The gray line. This is from early in the pandemic, the first few months of the pandemic, from March to October of 2020. The gray line are the number of COVID cases in the 30 poorest neighborhoods of Toronto. The blue line is the number of COVID cases in the 30 richest neighborhoods of Toronto. Did the lockdowns protect the poor? The lockdowns had no effect on the poor. The disease just spread anyways. Why? Because they couldn't afford to stay at home. They didn't have jobs that could be replaced by Zoom. Zoom caused the lockdown. The other way to think about this is the lockdowns are trickle-down epidemiology. Trickle-down epidemiology. The theory is that if we protect the laptop class, everyone is protected, right? How well does that actually work out? So let me just read the caption on this thing. You have this guy sitting here with a nice barbecue going on. He's sipping something, probably wine, I don't know what that is, might be champagne. And he has a nice house. And he's looking up at all these people living in this building. And he says, what part of social distancing do you people not understand? This is the reality of the lockdown. It was really, really fine for some people and not fine for others. The thing is, the people it was fine for are the people who control the policy. Okay, vaccine mandates. I think I've covered most of this ground. Vaccines don't stop disease spread. But from a Christian perspective, the idea that we have created a class of people that are unclean, that are not right to be around, that is something that, as for Christians, should be anathema. But every single aspect of the pandemic policies involve the creation of this idea of clean and unclean. Right? So if you get COVID, was it a shame to get COVID? Was it a failure? A moral failure to get COVID? I did everything right, but then I got COVID. Everyone heard that?
Yeah.
If you are masked, are you clean? Did anyone have the experience of walking down the street without a mask, and then a masked person coming up towards you, jumping onto the sidewalk to get out of your way? The masks make you clean. Or how many people lost a job because they didn't want to get a vaccine? A lot of people in the room. I mean, why? Because you're unclean. Right? And your neighbors asked you, who was uninvited to Christmas because they didn't have a vaccine? Because why? Because you're unclean. I'm trying to think of things where we violate our commitments as Christians more as to treat each other as unclean in any way. Jesus touched the leper. Right? He shattered the idea of unclean. And so this is data from Qatar. What this shows is that about 4 months or 5 months after you get the vaccine, the efficacy against transmission drops to 20%, which is basically nothing. Right? You don't actually, are no longer protected against disease spread. I've been telling you over and over again, and I actually do firmly believe that the vaccine protects you against severe disease and death. The reason is from studies like this. This is also from the same study, same group of people comparing vaccinated and unvaccinated. And this is efficacy against dying from COVID or being hospitalized against COVID. And up to 6 or 7 months, there's still about 90% efficacy. This is too small a sample to say anything significant. There are other studies that show that it goes roughly up to 9 months. 9 months of protection against severe disease and death from the vaccine. It's not perfect, it's not randomized data, but it's the best that I know of. And what that means is the vaccines can be used for focused protection, not used to stop people from spreading the disease, not used to distinguish people clean and unclean. And so that means the vaccine mandates are useless, right? Now let me talk about the Great Barrington Declaration. I'm almost done, but I also want to talk about the church at the end of this. the Great Barrington Declaration, I wrote it with Sunetra Gupta, she's in the middle, and Martin Kulldorff. She teaches at Oxford. I think she's the world's best epidemiologist. And then there's Martin Kulldorff, who is was a professor at Harvard at the time, and he designed the statistical sort of the statistical infrastructure we use to track vaccine safety in the United States. Actually, not just the United States. Absolutely brilliant man. He invited me to come to this town, which I'd never heard of, with the unlikely name of Great Barrington, Massachusetts. I arrived in the town, and I talked to Martin, I talked with Sunetra, and we decided we were going to write a little something to say we needed a different pandemic policy. And I'm the one that came up with the name. That's my main claim to fame. Because on the name, the drive over, I kept thinking Port Huron Statement. It was like some hippies had written it in the 60s, but it made a big deal. But I was like, Great Barrington. That's a great name for a declaration. Because you can't tell, is the declaration great or is it so we wrote this in October 4, 2020. Tens of thousands of doctors, scientists signed on. Millions of people signed on. How many of you signed on? Oh, bless you all. The declaration, it doesn't say anything, and you can already tell what it says from what I've said already so far. You have this steep age gradient in the mortality risk. So what should you do? Protect the old. You have lockdowns which are harming everybody, especially the young, without any effect on decreasing the harm to protecting them really, because they face low risk from COVID. So lift the lockdowns. That's the strategy. Now the thing is, there's not one original word in it, not one original thought in it. This is the old pandemic plan that has worked for a century of respiratory viral pandemics. Protect the vulnerable, lift the lockdowns. How do you protect the vulnerable? Well, before the advent of the vaccines, it was actually kind of difficult to say. It would depend on local living circumstances of the old in each community. I would have advised in October 2020, even as I signed the declaration, that we not hold meetings just like this where many, many old people would come. I would say let's have it at a more spaced place or hold it outdoors. I would advise all kinds of things like delivering groceries to older people, changing how we manage nursing homes to reduce the risk of bringing disease in, all kinds of things like that. Once the vaccines came available, that argument went away. How do you protect the old? Offer the vaccine, because you reduce the risk of severe disease and death. For young people, lead near normal lives. For kids, let them go to school, have fun, be children. Don't steal their childhood from them, which is what we did. I'll talk about this in a second. The effect of this was enormous. Not because it changed policy. The effect of it was enormous because what it did is it told the world that there was not a consensus in favor of lockdown. Who felt sane when they heard the Great Barrington Declaration? I did. The Great Barrington Declaration shattered the illusion that there was a consensus in favor of lockdown by experts. In fact, so if you have Oxford, Stanford, Harvard, and you have Nobel Prize winners saying the lockdowns are crazy, don't do that. Well, that means that there's a lot of people who know better saying don't do that. The medical community, the scientific bureaucrats in charge of COVID policy, reacted in an incredibly unethical way. What they did is there was an email from the head of the National Institute of Health calling me and my colleagues, the world's best epidemiologist, Sunetra Gupta, me, and Martin Kulldorff, who designed the vaccine safety surveillance systems. He called the three of us fringe epidemiologists. Fringe epidemiologists. Fringe. F-R-I-N-G-E, Fringe. I don't know if I brought the card. I had a friend of mine made cards that say Fringe epidemiologist. Oh no. Pride. And now I think fringe epidemiology is actually the right place to be. It's like, we don't. It's a term of pride now. I think that the problem was for them was that they needed to maintain the illusion that there was a consensus. What do you have to do? Well, you have to follow what do you have to follow nowadays? It's not follow Christ, it's follow the science. Follow the science. Well, what is the science? If Stanford, Harvard, Oxford professors are saying the science might be focused protection, then you don't need the lockdown, right? But you have, in order to delegitimize that, the powers that be waged a propaganda campaign against these ideas and against the people that are espousing them. So, for instance, in Australia, there were stories about the Great Barrington Declaration in the ABC that essentially said we wanted to kill people, we wanted to let the virus rip. That happened all over the world. I started getting calls from reporters asking me why I wanted to let the virus rip. I've never thought about letting the virus rip. I thought about how to protect older people. I thought about how to protect young people from the lockdown harms. And unfortunately, I have to say they succeeded. Right? Most people thought that the consensus was lockdowns for much of the pandemic, which is unfortunate because it really wasn't. Okay, so what's the best ethical case you can make for Australian policy? Right, so the lockdowns may have delayed the incidence of COVID to after the development of the vaccine. That's the best ethical case you can make. That means it saves some lives. It absolutely did. Right? You have to concede that because it's true. I think it imposed net harm on many vulnerable people, including especially children, because the lockdowns are so harmful in exactly the way I showed you. And that's just even within Australia, not even counting the harm to the rest of the world. It was enforced by an absolutely immoral propaganda campaign designed to create fear and panic and dissension among people, socially divisive, to make people think that treating other people as biohazards was kindness and love. The vaccine rollout, I think, was delayed in part because of the lockdowns. Right? The lockdowns, because you had conquered COVID, then you don't really need to be vaccinated because you have zero COVID. Why do you need to be vaccinated if there's no COVID in the land, right? So the rollout itself was a consequence of the early success of the lockdown. And then here's the last part. The vaccine, which essentially ended the lockdown, could not have been developed in Australia or in New Zealand. Because in order to test the vaccine, you need people to have COVID. There's no COVID in Australia, it means you can't test the vaccine. You can't do a trial in Australia. So Australia and New Zealand relied on other people's suffering in order to be free. And I think this is the best ethical case you can make for the Australian policy. Because I think the American policy is extremely immoral. I think the entire world's policy, except for maybe Sweden and Florida, is deeply immoral. Australia, as I said earlier, and Melbourne in particular, is the most important place because the power of this argument is the strongest here, the top argument. You save lives by delaying when COVID arrived. But you have to balance that against all the harms. Okay, COVID in the church. Now this one really saddens me. You guys ready for this one? We have to talk about these, right? Because it's the only way we reform ourselves by looking squarely in the eye what we've done. Okay, the church, Mike, this is my governor. You guys, if I put Dan Andrews, you'd hiss, right? If I put this up in California, similar items in California, they'd hiss. This is Governor Gavin Newsom, who I hope is never going to be president. This is from July 2020, just after the first wave. He'd already done this. He closed churches, businesses as COVID cases surge. Are churches essential?
Yes.
Not according to this guy. The church in LA agreed with him and shut down. The LA Archdiocese closes all churches in hopes of easing coronavirus danger. When I say the church, I'm a Protestant. I don't mean just the Catholic Church. I think my church, the Presbyterian church I go to, for a year and a half did not meet in person. The Catholic Church didn't do much better, although there were some counterexamples. So like in San Francisco, there's a few parishes that stayed open. And the Archbishop of San Francisco actually essentially winked at that, allowed it to happen. There were some churches. So there's an evangelical church in San Jose, close to where I live, that defied the governor. It used to be a small church, maybe 100 people would come. It exploded to 1,500 people. The pastor there told me that he would have people come and tell him that if he hadn't stayed open, that the people would have killed themselves. It was like the lifeline. They would have human connection once a week. The church is in San Jose. The county public health officer is my boss's wife. She persecuted that church. $3 million in fines still imposed on that church. Still trying to get the pastor to bankrupt the church because he stayed open. California pastors defy the governor's and reopen churches are part of the answer, not the problem. Is that true?
Yes.
I believe it's true. Now that doesn't mean the churches could have needed to do nothing in consequence. They could have had outdoor services when the weather was nice. They could have had separate services for older people and younger people. They could have tried to reduce the risk when the disease spread was high. But you could have still had mass. You could have still had last rites for people that died. You could have still had baptisms. You could have still had the church life that we all really need. This guy? This guy is Governor Ron DeSantis. This is my favorite governor. I've never loved politicians. I know there's some politicians here, but I just say I've never fallen in love with politicians before the pandemic. I'm kind of in love with this guy. I saw this story. I couldn't believe it. I was like, there's a governor that thinks this? Churches will remain open in Florida as GOP Governor Ron DeSantis declares them essential.
Yes.
They are essential.
Yeah.
We could have met in ways that honored our commitment to fellowship with one another in Christ while still seeking to protect the vulnerable. My colleague Martin Kuhldorff wrote this tweet, which I wanted to reproduce in 2021 April. Vaccine passports are not only terrible for public health, UK church leaders said, to shut out those deemed by the state to be social undesirables would be anathema to us and the denial of truth of the gospel. Thank God for those I think Anglican bishops that said this. So there were heroes. I don't want to paint the church as failed entirely. Another hero, a set of heroes, is the Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn sued the governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, and won in the Supreme Court for the right to have church. This case opened the door to churches all across the United States. I personally was involved, not with this case, but 3 other cases that reached the Supreme Court as an expert. Let me just show you one of them. This case in December of 2020, Supreme Court sides with church challenging California's COVID restrictions. That's my case. Right after this case happened, then the Supreme Court then decided this case, allowing churches in California to open. And yet, there's still $3 million of fines against Pastor Mike. I was involved in this case. In April of 2021, the Supreme Court finally allowed home Bible studies to happen in my county. You think the United States has the First Amendment? For a year and a half, for almost over a year, I couldn't have home Bible studies in my house. 1 in 5 churches, this is the United States, 1 in 5 churches facing permanent closures within 18 months due to the COVID-19 shutdowns. And this is the Presbyterian churches. The churches that stayed closed are dying. The churches that stayed open have thrived. What is the purpose of our lives? From Romans 14:7-9, for none of us lives for ourselves alone, and none of us dies for ourselves alone. If we live for the Lord. If we die for the Lord. So whether we live or die, we belong to the Lord. For this very reason, Christ died and returned to life, so he might be the Lord of both the dead and the living. The purpose of life isn't the avoidance of a single infectious disease. For each of us, we have a purpose, and it's much more than that. I'm just end with I'm now part of 3 new organizations that what we're trying to do is we're trying to make lockdown into a dirty word. Reform science so that these kinds of conversations that ought to have been happening in science can happen in future. Return science to its proper place, advising, not on top of society. So Brownstone, we're going to make lockdown a dirty word. Academy of Science and Freedom, we're going to restore science to its proper place in society. We're going to have freedom of speech within science. And then Collateral Global, which is over here, is a UK charity where we're going to help inform with research what lockdown harms happened around the world. I've showed you some of the outputs of that already. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful to you.
Thanks so much, Jay. Does anyone have a question? Maybe if you could, I'll bring the mic over.
John is here.
My question is, the Academy for Science and Freedom, how can you have a voice in science and freedom of voice in science when it's always related to money for research?
Well, I think there's no way to avoid money for research. The problem is, because research is expensive. It can be expensive. The key thing is, the problem wasn't directly the money. It's that the people that fund research were also directly involved in setting COVID policy. That's a conflict of interest. So just take Tony Fauci, the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease in the United States. He sits on a pile of billions of dollars that funds the work of every prominent epidemiologist in infectious disease, every immunologist, and every virologist in the United States that does infectious disease work, or nearly everyone. That money isn't just money so that you can do research, it's also social status. If you win a grant from his institution, that allows you to get tenure at your medical school where you work. It's fine to have somebody in charge of that money. You have to have somebody in charge of that money. The research is often life-saving. The problem is, he's now saying lockdowns are the only way. I'm a scientist that gets money from him. I'm going to be very scared about contradicting him. There's a conflict of interest, just as we think there's a conflict of interest between pharmaceutical companies deciding whether a drug should be approved or not. That's an obvious conflict of interest, right? There's also a conflict of interest of health policy, health funders being so closely involved with health policy decision making. There should be a bright line between that. So this is the kinds of stuff we want to work on. And how do you restore ethics to scientific discussion so that these kinds of conflicts of interest don't happen? We have to do that. So you can't be cynical and say it can't be done. It's failed now. Everyone knows that. But it has to succeed. And the question is, how do we restore science so that those ethical lines are drawn very brightly?
Thank you, Dr. J. It's an excellent talk you've just given. Look, this is more of a comment rather than a question so much as an article in today's Daily Telegraph in London was non-COVID deaths at home leapt by almost a third during lockdown. So that nearly 90,000 people, more people than usual, died at home from non-COVID cases during the pandemic, leading to fear that some could not access medical treatment or passed away without pain relief. I mean, that's just a travesty of the whole situation, really. That's in the
Tens of
UK.
thousands of people died of heart attacks in the UK because they were told the NHS was so clogged that they couldn't, that they should just wait. And they waited and they died at home. Again, with no pain relief, that probably would have survived if there had been reasonable health care. The idea that we can save lives by just focusing on protection against one infectious disease was utterly foolish. Right? There's even just for health, the threats to human health are so multifaceted, and public health has always been to me about that fact. There's so many aspects of health. You have to think about all of them. I'm an economist, so you're going to laugh at me, but I think life is just full of trade-offs. Every time I see something, I think of a trade-off. That's what public health is too. We should have been thinking about those people that died at home. That might not have died at home had we been thinking about them.
Chris Brooks, Jay, and it's fabulous to have you here in Australia. The whole COVID narrative and the lockdown policies, can be best described as a can of worms because there's just so many issues that are interrelated and can be confused. And I'm a little bit interested to get your comment because even in your presentation and some of your interpretations of what's happened, you're relying on the cases that are derived from PCR testing. And yet we can listen to many, many debates and conversations around the world critical of the PCR testing. And I can even remember very early in the piece listening to Wolfgang Wogard and Subrat Bhakti giving some short video commentaries, and right at the start they were almost in tears predicting that this is going to have nothing to do with health. This is going to be all about a pandemic of testing numbers.
That's right.
And so even quite a lot of that information that you presented relies on a can of worms regarding what is a case and what were people ill or were they not ill, and how effective or ineffective have been treatments or vaccines, and all of these things have been interpreted through this lens of PCR testing, which I guess my reasoning and understanding, having consumed lots of information, is that the PCR testing is so misleading that it just needs to be taken completely out of the equation.
So a couple of thoughts about this. So first, one of the reasons I wanted to do, I did those antibody studies was because of that reason. I think the testing does depend on how you define what a case is. And in many jurisdictions, the definition of a case was extremely liberal, right? Even people that had fragments of virus in them that weren't going to cause infection at all were counted as cases in many places. The antibodies are easier to understand. If you have antibodies, I can count you as having had the disease and recovered from it. There's still a problem there because sometimes antibodies decay over time, so I might be undercounting in some cases. There's no perfect way to see. I mean, we're not God. We can't so we have to look at using noisy measures and then try to interpret them based on the best we can given the biases we know. So I'll give you one bias I think has affected things in Australia differently than the United States. In Australia, you count a COVID death as someone who's had some symptoms that look like COVID and a COVID positive test within 28 days of death. In the United States, we count anyone with a positive PCR test within the last 60 days or more as a COVID death. So I said 5 times more COVID deaths in the United States than Australia. I don't actually know that that's true. If we had the same COVID definition, it'd be. And there's another financial thing actually here. In the United States, if you die of COVID, your family will get paid up to $10,000 US dollars for the funeral. If your loved one died of a heart attack and not of COVID, your family will get paid $0. There's a very strong incentive to die of COVID in the United States than of something else. You're absolutely right. The numbers are you have to interpret them with some degree of cynicism, and that's completely legitimate. I present them because those are the numbers we have, and in my line of work, every number I always look at with some degree of cynicism. Everything's measured with error, sometimes systematic error, sometimes biased. The use of a PCR test that is so sensitive did actually spur a lot of the panic, absolutely. But there's some reality to them too, so please take them with a grain of salt, absolutely.
Okay, can I ask a question about the comparison between the US death rate versus Australia, which you showed as a significant different per capita, per case? It wasn't per case, it was per capita.
No, per capita, yeah.
You sort of said that success was, you attributed to the vaccine rollout and the timing of that. We hit an Omicron point at December and January. Our cases went to about 100,000 cases per day in the middle of January, in the middle of the height of summer, which was Omicron.
Yeah.
And you also acknowledged that Omicron had a much lower death rate in terms of the consequence. How do you tease out the difference between whether the vaccine was doing this or the effect of the vaccine, the Omicron variant itself was why we were lucky?
Maybe that's really hard, as you know. In fact, Sunetra Gupta and I disagree about the inherent infection fatality rate of Omicron being milder. Sunetra thinks that it's just as severe as the original one, and that the only difference is the Omicron hit the world that already had immunity due to lots and lots of people being infected, and also lots of people being vaccinated. So teasing that apart is very difficult. The reason why you had an Omicron wave in your summer is because there was almost no immunity in the Australian population, right? So California had a wave in our summer in 2020. Again, there's almost 4%. I know how much immunity there was in the population. 4% had antibodies in April of 2020. The seasonality of this virus comes out when it's endemic. When you have a highly immune population, it tends to spread very rapidly in winter, much less rapidly in summer. And so you see that as the years have worn on, you see the seasonality pattern more clearly. The lack of seasonality in Australia had to do with the lack of immunity in the population. I've been surprised by this virus. Maybe I'm wrong about seasonality. That's my best interpretation of the data I've seen so far. But we'll see. We'll see as the years wear on whether it establishes that pattern. I'm pretty confident it will, because the other coronaviruses that are very close cousins to this one have that seasonality pattern to them.
I just have another question as well, relating to that graph as well. We know that COVID, for a lot of different age groups, the death rate was quite small. So in terms of the actual amount of people who died from COVID, is there a difference between the American and the Australian population in terms of the amount of comorbidities that those people then did have? Because just from my limited knowledge about Australia compared to America, we do have maybe a healthier population in terms of certain
so Americans are among
attributes
the most
and
obese
stuff.
in the world. I mean, let's not be polite. Americans tend to be obese.
Yeah.
Americans have a lot of comorbidities. Australia, I think, is a tiny bit older than America.
Yeah.
So those tend to offset. I should be showing you age-adjusted death rates, but I don't.
Yeah.
And I should show you comorbidity-adjusted death rates. I don't think it changes the story, which is why I didn't show it. It's just simpler to talk about it this way. But you're absolutely 100% right. When you're making these kinds of comparisons, the right thing to do is to adjust for the age structure of the population and also the comorbidity structure.
Yeah.
I think this is the case rates for Australia. This is the death rates for Australia. Let's adjust them by squinting, the old-fashioned way. Maybe the PCR test is in the U.S. There's a really strong incentive to count deaths as COVID, so we'll take this down a notch. Maybe in Australia you're a little bit younger, a little less obese, so we take this up a notch if we adjust for that. I don't think it makes up for the difference. And I have also that evidence from Qatar that says that the vaccines protected against severe disease and death. I think the vaccines are...
Do we know a percentage of the amount of people roughly that were incentivized to call it COVID death? Because I know like in Australia we actually had like press that would say that someone died of like cancer, didn't even have COVID.
Yes.
It was COVID, or like someone that was in a car crash.
I think
the only reason why it got picked up was because people in that family were incredibly upset, and then it like called out the media, and so it kind of made people very aware. But it would be very interesting to see if you started taking in monetary incentivizations and different things, how that would start adjusting.
I'll tell you a study that I did in 2020, where I tried to answer that question. And what I did is I looked at the sequence of healthcare claims leading up to a death in the elderly population. And if they looked like a car crash and then death, and you called it COVID, I'd say no, that's not COVID. If it was like pneumonia, then ICU admission, and then death, I'd call it probably COVID. And it was about 25% that were probably not COVID.
Interesting.
That was in 2020. During the Omicron, I think it's much higher. Probably like much of the Omicron deaths or COVID is just incidental in the U.S. So I think it's more on the order of 50% of deaths like that.
Because I know in the Italian study that was in the beginning, it went around the world to show how bad it was, and then they went and readjusted it, and it was a huge dramatic drop in terms of how many people actually died from COVID, that spread the fear around the world for everyone as well. So,
Yeah, there was a comment earlier about the PCR test. The PCR test absolutely created panic. Absolutely. When you see these case numbers exploding, it was partly designed to create panic, right? Because they set the threshold so high that nearly everybody, even if you had dead virus and not infectious, you were going to call out a case. And then, as soon as you had a case in Australia, what did you guys do? Lockdown, right? It was a test that was absolutely designed to create panic and fear, and it succeeded. Okay. Now I'm being unfair. I always try to be fair. So what was the intellectual argument on the other side? The intellectual on the other side was, well, okay, fine. We'll find some people who have some virus in them but are not infectious. We can quarantine them, fine, but we'll get everybody. We'll never miss anybody. The idea was that somehow we could track and find every single person who had COVID, isolate them, and then they wouldn't spread the disease, and the disease would die away. That theory was completely insane. This is a virus that's spread by breathing.
Yeah, that's right.
It's a virus that's spread by breathing.
Symptoms too. It spreads prior to symptoms.
It spreads prior to symptoms, it's spread by breathing. The idea that we could control and it spread by cats and dogs, white-tailed deer. This is a virus that'll be with us forever, just like the other coronaviruses. We have no technology of getting rid of it, and I don't see any prospect of a technology getting rid of it. We should have, if we accepted that to begin with, we would have a very different set of outcomes as far as the lockdown goes.
Maybe one last question.
Yeah, could I get...
We'll get two.
You want one?
No, we'll do two questions. You go and then
okay. Look, my question is, what do you think, what's your opinion of the ethics and morality of a lot of certainly Western governments around the world, that even until now keep saying that the vaccines are safe and effective? Basically, there is nothing said in that statement regarding age groups, as you outlined earlier. The age groups in very young age groups and even up to the age of 50, and so very, very small. And the ads just keep saying safe and effective, with nothing else added to that. Now, a person who listens to that may have the impression that they're 100% safe and effective. If you don't look at any other alternative opinions on that, or research on that, well, that's what you think. And that's where the divide starts to come in between people who are thinking of the one side, as you say, victimising a set of people for making certain choices. But what do you think of why do you think governments have made it that clear and concise over many, many months, and in fact even years now, safe and effective? It's still an experimental drug. It hasn't been researched for the number of years that most other vaccines have been researched. So where does that come from, do you believe?
I mean, I think it's designed to convince everybody to get vaccinated. And the reason I think that governments made that a priority is they thought that if everyone's vaccinated, the disease will stop transmitting. It's the same reason why they did the vaccine mandates. Is it safe and effective? I think, I told you how effective I think it is. I think it's fairly effective at one thing, which is reducing the risk of disease mortality, but very ineffective at stopping transmission. Do I think it's safe? There's very good evidence that if you're a young man and you take one of these mRNA vaccines, you are exposing yourself to high risks of myocarditis. High meaning like 1 in 1,000, 1 in 2,000, 1 in 3,000. I'm not sure exactly the number, but somewhere in there. And it doesn't stop you from getting COVID, so that means that, because COVID can also cause myocarditis. So you get now 2 draws at the myocarditis urn. One's from the vaccine, one's from COVID. And I don't think that the vaccine protects you against the COVID myocarditis very well. So yeah, I mean, it's not safe in that sense. It's not like tremendously unsafe. I don't think it's causing mass death. I think I've seen people say that, and I don't see that in the epidemiological data. But I think for some groups of people, on net is not wise, especially young men with the mRNAs. Children, I don't understand what the impetus is. They have so low risk of dying from COVID. The vaccine protects them against a minuscule risk. I don't know that it causes a huge amount of side effects in children. It might. We don't know. As you said, it's still experimental. Why would I expose a child to something that's not going to benefit them and probably might cause them harm? So I think this, and now I say this in a blanket way, but I should be very careful, because there may be children with certain chronic conditions that predispose them to bad outcomes if they get COVID, for whom the vaccine is wise. The vaccine should be a private decision made between you and your doctor. And it should stay there. And there should be no moral judgment on it whatsoever. And I think on net, what would happen if that were the case is many older people would get it, because on net it's beneficial to them. I'm not saying it's completely safe. I'm saying the uncertainty about safety is offset by the benefit. And many younger people, most younger people wouldn't get it, but there would be some that would. And it would be, and there wouldn't be social division around it.
Building on what you're saying about moral judgment with regards to choosing the vaccine, if as Christians we believe we're made in the image and likeness of God, is it in all good conscience the right thing to do to have a vaccine that alters our DNA and includes aborted human fetus cells?
Okay, so a couple of things about, there's 2 things in that question. So let me do the easier one first, just because that's what professors do, and maybe you'll forget you asked me the hard question. The aborted human cells, the mRNAs were, and basically every drug, almost every drug in use in humans, not every drug, but almost human drugs, involves some testing during the development of them with aborted human cell lines. That is a cell that was originally aborted human tissue, but then has been replicated like 5 million generations later. So it's not directly aborted human tissue. They were developed with some experiments that involved some of those lines. But the vaccines themselves are not produced using any of those lines. The vaccines themselves they're developed using not so the knowledge about how the vaccines should be partly depends on those lines, but the actual product you're putting into you don't include any aborted human cell lines if you're taking the mRNAs. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine, I think, actually does have some aborted cell lines that are involved in the actual production of the vaccine. So I think for some people that's much more morally problematic, and some people, the other one is less problematic. Is that right? I have to leave that to your conscience. I talked to many Christians that have no problem whatsoever with the first, and some problem with the second. I've also talked to Christians who I believe are good Christians in good conscience that have no problem with either. And I've talked to Christians that have a problem with both. And I think the Holy Spirit works in us to give us conscience for some purpose. And it's strange to me, but not surprising, that sometimes the Holy Spirit produces a different judgment about these kinds of issues in lots of different Christians. What was that second question? It was very difficult.
DNA altering.
Oh yeah, okay, awesome. I think that the image of God that we have is not actually dependent on our DNA. That's my belief as a Christian. That our image of God, the image that God imprints on me, is outside of the physical body that I have. Right? So I had the image of God imprinted on me when I was a little child. I look very different than I look now. DNA, germline DNA, is altered. Like I have lots of different germline DNA, right? Like my sperm is different. Like each sperm is different. Each egg is different. But those are all imprinted with the image of God, I think. The link between I'm saying this now. I'm so far outside of my bounds. I'm not a philosopher. I'm not a theologian. I've had thoughts on this. So I don't think that the physical manifestation of my body is exactly the same thing as the image. So for instance, my identity. What's my identity? Is my identity that I'm a male? Is my identity that I'm heterosexual? Is my identity that I'm a father? Is my identity that I'm a son? What is my identity? My identity imprinted on me by the image of God is not any of those things. Those are important, but that's not really my image. The image is the relationship I have with God. That's the central, most important part of my identity. So I think it's a very difficult question to answer. I'm sure I didn't do it justice. So I don't believe that if we had a technology to alter our DNA, that would mean that we're like playing with our image. I'll say one other thing about this that makes it easier to answer. This vaccine, mostly there's I'll tell you one tiny bit of evidence that contradicts this, but I don't think it's actually definitive. I don't think this vaccine generally alters our DNA permanently. It doesn't alter our germline. What it does is it induces the mRNAs induces our cells to produce spike protein that would otherwise not produce by putting mRNA snippets in that are not. Those cells tend to get destroyed by our immune system, and these and the cells that produce the mRNA that have the mRNA, they don't get incorporated in the DNA. There's one piece of evidence that's the contrary of that. There was a study, I think in Switzerland, where they did a petri dish study, where they somehow they measured some incorporation of the DNA of some DNA version of the mRNA was incorporated in those petri dishes to the DNA of some liver cell that were testing it in. I don't know that happens in real life. I just know that in that one lab, in that one place, they managed to get the DNA to get incorporated. I don't know that DNA then replicates to produce new cells. I don't know any of that. So I don't know that we have a scientific basis to say that our DNA is altered. What I'm trying to say is that even if it were the case, I would still not worry about changing the image of God. Because I think the image of God is imprinted on us whether we have one DNA or another. It's not really the DNA that determines who we are. There's one more. There's one more in the back.
Quick question.
Yeah, quick one.
Yeah, possibly. The government's done obviously a great job at dividing the vaccinated community with the unvaccinated community groups. For example, whenever there was the COVID cases would come out, they would tell us how many unvaccinated people had COVID versus how many vaccinated. And a big reason why the unvaccinated people didn't want to get the vaccine was because we feared that the vaccine might harm us. So just wondering, has there been, are there any studies that have looked at into the all-case mortality rates of the vaccinated community versus the unvaccinated community?
So the randomized studies looked at that. And there's this fantastic epidemiologist in Denmark named Christine Stable-Ben, who looked at the randomized studies on the mRNA vaccines and the randomized studies on the adenovector virus vaccines, the AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson. And she found actually a stunning result, which is that the Johnson & Johnson AstraZeneca vaccines in the randomized trials did reduce all-cause mortality outside of the bound of statistical significance. It was a statistically significant reduction in all-cause mortality. The mRNAs, there's no such evidence from the trial. In fact, the people who were vaccinated in the trials with the mRNAs versus the controls had almost exactly the same all-cause mortality rate. Now, there were very few deaths in both arms, so you can't say that they're statistically meaningful. So the trials themselves don't determine whether you reduces all-cause mortality, which is really unfortunate. We should have had trials that answered that question, but unfortunately we didn't, and we're never going to. So I have to look at other evidence. That's why I showed you that evidence from Qatar. Right?
Can I just make a comment about that? Because how they define vaccinated versus unvaccinated, someone was considered unvaccinated, I believe, until after they had had, it was 14 days.
2 doses in 14 days, yeah.
Yeah, so you could have had 2 days and it have been 13 days after the second, and you're considered unvaccinated.
Yeah, I mean, that's the standard. It's a little bit of a trickery for sure.
No, yeah, it is.
Yeah, because just the 14 days after you're vaccinated, after you had the second dose, you're actually at a higher risk of getting COVID. Now that's a fact. What should have been done with that is telling people that are vaccinated, be careful during those first 14 days because you're more likely to get COVID. That's just a fact. I mean, I'm giving you the standard in the literature on this. If you adjust for what you're saying, what you'll see is that that means that the protection against infection drops relative to what I measured, what the Qatari people measured. So you go from 22% down to 0. It's the same message. I don't think it affects the protection against mortality, against COVID-19 mortality very much. Because I've seen adjusted versions of those graphs. It reduces it some, but not very much. Because not very many people die of COVID in the first place, vaccinated or unvaccinated. Okay, thank you everybody. Really.
Jay, thanks so much, mate. I wish we could do another hour. I would happily just give you the phone book and ask you to just read from it, mate. I'm listening to you. A few quick things. One was, that was a really interesting question you asked at the end, and we happen to have one of Australia's best bioethicists at the back of the room. Father Pascal, can you put your hand up for us? I would go and try that one on here. You did admirably.
Okay.
Considering your outside to do it.
Okay, please.
I forgot at the start of the talk to point to a man who's over here, Neil Angus. Do you mind putting your hand up, Neil? We've obviously been a little bit disappointed with some of our politicians over the last few years, but this is one of the good ones. And can everyone give him a round of applause? We've got an election coming up in November. Funny that you should be here just before that, Jay. I wonder if that's a coincidence. It's obviously crucially important that we make our voices heard in this election, and that we try and share what we've heard tonight. And what I think everyone here in this room probably has found it really difficult over the last few years, finding the world's gone crazy, and you feel like you're the only one. Well, you're not. And there's incredible strength and wisdom in this room. I just want to applaud all of you. Can you all give yourselves a round of applause? I've been following Jay around this week, and I've gotten to meet so many people who, suffered and found it such a trial over the last few years. And there's great benefit in coming together like this and meeting fellow people, fellow travellers, and getting to hear from people like Jay. Can I encourage you? One thing you can do is, tomorrow night there's a talk at Australian Catholic University that Jay's going to give as part of a panel. And I think you've seen tonight that he's an exceptional speaker, and he's got a real great warmth and generosity of spirit, as well as his incredible knowledge and understanding of the technical details of these incredibly complex issues. He's a great communicator. And I think one of the best things you can do, if you've had the experience I have of finding it extremely difficult to communicate to people who disagree about these topics, I think you could do better than put them in front of Jay. Whether it's a YouTube video or some other forum, or tell them to get along to Australian Catholic University tomorrow and have a listen. I think he's got the ability to change people's minds and change people's hearts and reach across the divide and help wake people up. drjnoz.com. I think you all know the website because you're here tonight. That's how you would direct people to that. I just want to mention the Knights of the Southern Cross, who helped put this God and Beer event on tonight, and each month the Knights of the Southern Cross do that. It's a wonderful group of men in the Catholic Church who do this great act of service, and they do many other great things as well. There's a great thing coming up in very soon called 40 Days for Life. Kathy, can you put your hand up? This is Kathy Clubb, one of the most amazing people in Melbourne. And if you'd like to know more about 40 Days for Life, please talk to her after the event. There's also some flyers on the table at the front. There's going to be a God and Beer in a couple of weeks. On Monday the 10th of October, we've got a speaker from America called, another American, Jay. There's so many great speakers over there. Called Tim Staples. He's going to be here at the Nott. We'll be next door in the steakhouse room, and he's going to speak about renewing the church, which obviously we're in great dire need of. I encourage you to come along to that. There's also flyers at the front about that. The last one is the Australians for Science and Freedom. So, as part of Jay's visit, I've been talking to doctors, scientists, and other academics, mathematicians, all kinds of different people who also, feel this has been crazy what we've done the last couple of years, and they would really like to form an organisation that can help carry on this fight, both now and in the future, so that this doesn't happen again, so that never again will we have to go through this kind of trauma. And if you are interested in that, you'll be hearing more about it via an email, but also feel free to come and talk to myself, talk to Eamon Matheson, if you can put your hand up, Eamon, and Arif over at the door. They're some of the academics and doctors who are part of this new organisation, which we hope will be a real significant force in bringing some sanity back to our public health debate. And David Richards, sorry David. And finally, my wife, Kate, and I. Kate, do you mind putting your hand up? This visit of Jay's to Australia was an initiative of Kate and I, and we've been really grateful. So many people have helped and supported us. If you would like to also support us, we'd be very grateful. There has been some expenses involved. I should mention that this man next to me, I offered, when I asked him to come out to Australia, I said, Jay, I'll give you some money for your time, obviously that would be reasonable. And he said, no, I won't accept any money. And I didn't quite understand, but he was genuine. He has accepted $0 for this, and any other work that you've heard him do around COVID, he's accepted $0 from it. He's doing it out of his own time, his own pocket, at no benefit whatsoever. Can everyone keep on the floor? That being said, there have been some expenses, so if you'd like to contribute, we'd be most grateful, and maybe one day I won't have to sleep on the couch again. thanks so much for coming, everyone. And oh, sorry, Andrew.
Just quickly, the video for of tonight's talk should be available hopefully tomorrow, if not Friday, on the God and Beer Facebook page in both Facebook and YouTube formats. So please keep an eye out. God and Beer on Facebook. Like, subscribe, and check out the videos and share.
Do you have the donations bucket out the front there?
Yeah, if you would like to make a donation, there'll be an opportunity to do that at the table. Thank you so much, and God bless you all. Good night.